Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the September 27th, 2017 meeting of the Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Commission. Before we get started with our regular agenda, we'll have a few housekeeping items to go through at the beginning. Excuse me. And so, let us begin with our general business Planning Commission action summary to receive. Do we have any committee reports from committees that met over the last month? Do we have any communications to receive from the public that are not appearing in our packet already? Seeing none, do we have any?
Chair, I think you have your August summary in the packet.
Yeah, okay. Shall we do that now or in order?
Yes, I think that's fine.
I beg your pardon?
Yeah,
Yes, what?
yes, go ahead and approve
Motion
your
to
action
approve.
summary.
Yes, thank you, please. Is there such a motion?
There is such a motion
Thank
to
you,
approve the minutes
Commissioner
of our
Kelly.
August meeting.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Culver. Any further discussion? All in favor, please raise your hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Minutes, those are called. Back to communications. Do we have any written communications from the public that are not in the packet?
No.
Communications from staff, planning commissioners, or other commissioners? I see we have two of them.
We do, Mr. Chairman. We've got a letter from Douglas County Public Works regarding an alley vacation in Vinland. A little-known statute that I wasn't even aware of. Apparently, notice goes to the Planning Commission when there's such a request, and in the unincorporated area. And so it's just a notice to you. If you have any comments, I can tell you we sort of looked at it and don't have any comments on your behalf to make on that particular one. We also have another communication from the city's Historic Resource Administrator regarding a number of landmark nominations going through our process. And again, by local code, we're required to notify the Planning Commission for comments as well. There's no additional action required on either one of these items. I would ask that you make a motion to receive these items for the record, and we'll put it in the meeting minutes.
Thank you. I would entertain such a motion now. Commissioner Willie?
I'll make a motion that we acknowledge that we have received the Public Works notice and regarding the landmark nominations.
Is there a second?
I'll second the motion, but in doing so, I'm just pleased to hear that Scott is human and there is something that he doesn't know about planning. So,
I'm more human than you think.
We have a snarky second from Commissioner Kelly. Further discussion among the commissioners? Seeing none, all in favor, please raise your hand. Carries unanimously. And second communication from staff memo. This is also something that we're required to receive.
Yeah, item C is an action, receiving an action of any waiver request or determination made by the city engineer. We bring maybe a couple of these to you a year. This particular one is at the Cadillac Ranch site in Leahy terms. And there's been a site plan submitted to redevelop that site. The code states that access to an arterial, 6th Street in this situation, is prohibited if there's reasonable access to be provided otherwise. And Crestline provides access to the site otherwise. So we've been working with the applicant on a site plan, and the city engineer has determined that the waiver request should be denied and has taken that action. Procedurally, that notice by code that gets placed on your agenda for notice. You don't determine the decision. It's already been made by the city engineer. You're not hearing an appeal on it. Most of the time we bring these to you for a determination of acceptance of a waiver. This is one of the rare ones that we've denied. The reason it's important in the code is because the code requires that your receiving of this action tonight begins I think a 14-day period of appeal to the applicant in this case. So that appeal would go to the city commission. And so your only action tonight is to receive the notice, and then that begins a 14-day appeal window for the applicant.
And again, we'll be looking for a motion to receive these. Commissioner Willie?
I'll make a motion that we acknowledge the receipt of the determination by the city engineer about West Sixth Street.
Thank you, Commissioner Willie. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, Commissioner.
Can we hear the motion again? We
Yes.
can't hear anything you said.
Okay.
I made a motion that we acknowledge the receipt of the determination made by the city engineer regarding the West Sixth Street property.
Moved by Commissioner Willie and seconded by Commissioner Payden. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, please raise your hand. Motion carries unanimously. All right, with that, we'll move on to our regular agenda, and I believe we have an item we'd like to move up to the beginning of our agenda tonight.
We need to cover ex parte and
Yes, we do.
abstention.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Willie. We're rushing through it here. Are there any ex parte communications that commissioners must disclose tonight? Disclose? None? And are there any abstentions among commissioners tonight? Yes,
I have
Commissioner
one.
Willie?
I need to abstain from item 2 because the church in question, my husband sits on the board, so I will step out for that item.
Okay. It is noted. And with that, we'll move on to our regular agenda item, and
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we have a request for you to move item 3 to the beginning of the agenda just to manage our hardworking staff resources. And the fact that we've got that item, which should be pretty simple in our opinion, we'll see how it goes. For that matter, you may wish to, so that's item 3, that's a final plat for Southland Meadows, number 4. You may wish to also see miscellaneous item number 1, which is a variance request related actually to the city engineer's determination you just received. And so those two are pretty quick items in my estimation. And if anybody is here for those items, that would allow them to leave, and we can get on to a little bit more of the meatier items after that. So we make that request to you.
with that, I would entertain a motion to move items 3 and miscellaneous 1 to the beginning of our agenda.
Sure. So moved.
Okay, there's a motion from Commissioner Willie. Second, please.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Sinclair. Any further discussion? All in favor, please raise your hand. Unanimous. We will start with item 3, final plat of Southland Meadows.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Mary Miller, one of the planners. This is a final plat, as you mentioned, for Southland Meadows Edition Number 4. It is located, the property is located adjacent to the Eudora city limits. Eudora does not have an urban growth area. However, we did communicate with the zoning and codes administrator, as it is adjacent to their city limits. This map shows city limits of Eudora in white. It shows the Valley Channel part of our rural county in brown. The blue is the agriculturally zoned properties, and the green is A1, or Suburban Home Residential District. And this is a close-up of this particular A1 zoning district. In 2006, when we adopted the new subdivision regulations, you were no longer able to rezone properties to the A1 district for new residential subdivisions, but you could still plat properties that were already zoned. This property was a little unique in that the rezoning was approved in, I think, 1986, but it was subject to a condition that it would be effective only after properties were platted. And this graphic shows the light green are the ones that were platted, so the zoning was in effect, and the darker green are the ones that still are waiting to be platted. And so this is a subject property here. It's a 15-acre property. It's going to be used just for one residential lot. And when we talked to the city of Eudora, they, looking at the scope of this project, indicated that the road 2114 did not need to be extended to this match the planned road in Eudora at this time, but they did want half of the required right-of-way dedicated with this plat, and when the property to the north plats, they'll get the other half of the right-of-way, so that this road can be extended to connect to the road system in Eudora. And they also noted they would not require annexation at this time since it's such a low-scale project. And so this is a picture of the plat. It is one lot. There will be 35 feet of right-of-way dedicated with the plat for the future extension of East 2114 Road. There will also be 30 feet of utility easement dedicated along the south side of that. The driveway for this lot will take access from the cul-de-sac, and the township fire department had said that was adequate for their fire equipment, so there were no changes needed to that. And whenever we do a final plat, we usually look at the preliminary plat and see if it's in substantial compliance. The preliminary plat was done quite a while ago. There are some changes with what's being proposed now. Previously, the road was going to curve up to the right or up to the north, but due to changes that were made with other final plats and with Eudora's plans, the road will now extend diagonally just to connect to Eudora. Also, this area would have had 3.5 lots, and it's just going to be one lot. So while it's changing from the preliminary plat, it's going to be less intensive, and so it's not seen to be necessary to revise the preliminary plat for that. And so staff recommends approval of this preliminary plat or a final plat and forwarding it to the county commission for acceptance of dedications. And we will also have a rezoning resolution for them so that when the final plat is recorded, then the rezoning can also become effective. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, and the applicant is also here today.
Thank you, Mary. The applicant would like to address the commission? All right.
Hello, my name is Derek Bradstreet. I'm the applicant. I don't have anything to really present unless you guys have specific questions for me, I guess.
We don't, this is a public hearing item, so we will have any public comment, you'll have a chance to respond to.
Sounds good.
All right. Is there anybody here to speak about this item from the public? Okay. Seeing none, I will bring it back to the committee for discussion, questions, or motions. Commissioner Willie.
It seems like a pretty straightforward item. I would go ahead and make a motion, and then if anyone has comments after that, you can go there. I would move that we approve the final plat for the Southland Meadows number 4 and forward it to the county commission, and for the acceptance of the dedications of right-of-way and easement.
We have a motion for approval. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Carpenter. Any further commission discussion? Then all those in favor of the motion to approve, please raise your hand. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll move on to miscellaneous item number 1. Variance of 2515 West 6th.
Good evening. My name is Becky Pepper with the Planning Department. This item is a variance request for a reduction of right-of-way for property at 2515 West 6th Street. The property is highlighted yellow here. It is located west of Iowa Street, south of 6th Street. Specifically, 6th Street borders to the north, and Crestline borders the property on the east. This map here shows you the existing right-of-way. The West 6th Street is classified as a principal arterial, which would require 150 feet of total right-of-way. There are a couple of dimensions shown on this map, and that's because this road, when it was constructed, the center line was not constructed to match up with the section line. So there is a total of 143 feet of right-of-way on this road. South of the section line, it contains 73 feet of right-of-way, and south of the center line, it varies between 64 and 66 feet. The city engineer has indicated that he does not have any, there are no issues with the variance for right-of-way on this road, given that the existing development of West 6th Street. A variance request is also been submitted for the right-of-way along Crestline Road. This is a local street, which would require 60 feet of right-of-way. It contains 50 feet, 25 feet on either side of the road center line. The city engineer indicated that he would support a variance request for the right-of-way width under the condition that a 5-foot pedestrian easement was also established with the minor subdivision that's been submitted. We have received a revised minor subdivision that shows that pedestrian easement. With that, staff recommends approval of the variance request to allow the right-of-way widths for West Sixth Street and Crestline Drive to remain at their current widths. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Becky. Is the applicant here tonight? Care to address the commission? No? All right. Then we'll bring it back up here to the commission for motions, discussions, questions. Then I will make a motion.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
So Becky, when you say pedestrian easement, does that mean that we get a sidewalk along Crestline?
Yes, and the site plan already shows a sidewalk along Crestline. This pedestrian easement would be in addition to that. If there needs more room adjustment, it would give them some ability to adjust that sidewalk with design.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion?
I'll make it.
Okay, go ahead. Commissioner Kelly?
Move to recommend approval of move to approve the variance request from section 20-18E5 to allow the right-of-way width for West Sixth Street and Crestline to remain at its current width.
All right.
I second.
We have a motion and a second from Commissioner Payton. Any further discussion? And all those in favor, please raise your hand. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Now let us go back to item 1, the text amendment for 401 Elm.
Good evening. We'll start item off with a text amendment request. This text amendment was initiated by the Planning Commission at their August 23rd, 2017 meeting to permit some non-residential uses in the tertiary zone of the MU district. The MU standards have language that protects residential neighborhoods by stating that a development zone must be assigned with an MU zoning district. And there are 3, and they are tiered in the intensity of development that they permit. The primary development zone permits the most intense development, and the type of structure that is permitted within that development zone is a vertical mixed use. And this means that non-residential land uses are permitted on the ground level, and then residential would either be above or below that. And these types of development zones are most appropriate in areas that anticipate heavy pedestrian traffic. The next development zone is secondary. This would contain developments that are less intense as compared to those permitted in the primary development zone, and they can contain either vertical mixed use or horizontal mixed use, meaning that you could have non-residential and residential land uses together on one level. And then it can also contain single structures that contain a single use, so they can have structures that are not mixed use in nature. And then these are most appropriate in areas where pedestrian traffic is moderate, and they can be designed with access to alleys and parking lots, so there's a mixture of pedestrian traffic and vehicular traffic. And then the last development zone is the tertiary development zone. This would have the least intense development. The the language of the tertiary, the language of the tertiary development zone protects the residential neighborhoods by stating that if a property that wishes to be zoned MU is located in a neighborhood that is surrounded by residential development, then it must be designated a tertiary development zone. And then the code goes on to say that with that tertiary development zone, the only non-residential land uses that are permitted are ones that are in existence in that development, surrounding that proposed mixed-use development. Now, this restriction includes all non-residential uses that would be permitted in certain single-family dwelling zoning districts. If we use 401 Elm Street as an example, what is listed here are all the non-residential land uses that would be permitted in the RS5 zoning district, which is what 401 Elm is currently zoned. These uses are permitted either outright or with approval of a special use permit. As you know, that 401 Elm has a rezoning request to be for MU district. And under the current language of the MU standards, the only non-residential land use that would be permitted in the MU district under today's code language would be the neighborhood church. And that's because that is the non-residential use that's surrounding the existing, the property. So the first part of the text amendment is a change to Article 4 to add a column to the non-residential use table to show the uses that would be permitted outright and with approval of a special use permit in the tertiary development zone. There are also some changes to the MU zoning district. This would be applicable to the primary and secondary zoning districts. As staff analyzed the code, we found some other changes aside from the tertiary zone. We have some recommended changes. And with that, I'm going to switch over to attachment A, your use tables, and walk you through some of the changes that we're proposing. To determine what land uses would be most appropriate for the tertiary development zone, we looked at the zoning districts RS5, RSO, RMO, and MU to see what is currently permitted and to help that with our analysis. This first section here are the residential uses, and this column here shows the residential uses that would be permitted in the MU zoning district. Staff's recommendation is that the the residential uses permitted in the tertiary use column align with what is already permitted in the MU, align with the primary and secondary MU standards. There are a couple of exceptions to that. First, this manufactured home and residential design. That is something that is currently not permitted under the MU zoning district, and that is because this is a land use that is more aligns with a single-family home and is more compatible with a less intense development. So we are proposing that while it's not permitted in the primary and secondary development zones, that it would be permitted in the tertiary because of the compatibility with that development zone. And then second, we are recommending that the second non-residential or residential item that I wanted to bring to your attention is this congregate living. This is the only other residential component that doesn't align with the existing MU. Right now, congregate living is a permitted use in the MU zoning district. We'd recommend that that be permitted in the tertiary development zone with approval of a special use permit. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. They're in your staff report, but I will point out a couple items. There it is. Under your medical facilities, the extended care facility, this is a use that is currently not permitted in the MU zoning district. After comparing the MU zoning district with the RS5, RSO, RMO zoning districts, where the extended care facility general is permitted in RSO through approval of a special use permit, and it is permitted outright in the RMO district, staff recommends that the land use table be updated to include, to permit this use in the MU zoning district in the primary and secondary development zones, and then permit it with approval of a special use permit in the tertiary development zone. I also want to bring your attention to the eating and drinking establishment section. There are a couple changes here. First of all, staff is recommending the private dining establishment and restaurant quality be the eating and drinking establishment uses that are permitted in the tertiary zone through approval of a special use permit. Also, through our analysis, we saw that the current MU standard, the current use table for MU zoning district did not align with what was shown for the RS5, RSO, and RMO zoning districts. Under that, they are permitted with a special use permit, and given the other eating and drinking establishments that are permitted in the MU district, staff recommends that the use table be updated to permit this use in the MU primary and secondary use category, and then, as I mentioned, permit it with approval of a special use permit in the tertiary development zone. And a couple more areas I wanted to bring to your attention before we finish with this use table. The retail sales and service section, we are recommending that business equipment and business support be permitted in the tertiary development zone with approval of a special use permit. As well as food and beverage, repair service, consumer, and retail sales general. We're also recommending that the personal convenience services and personal improvement services be permitted outright. And then lastly, I'm going to take you down to the industrial facilities section. In this area, we are recommending that the Makerspace Limited, Manufacturing and Production Limited, and the research service uses be permitted in the tertiary development zone with approval of a special use permit. We are also recommending that the primary and secondary development zones be added to the use table for this to be a permitted use in the MU primary and secondary development zone. Moving on to the second part of the text amendment. Usually that comes back up. Okay, thank you. All right. Part 2 of the text amendment makes changes to section 20-1108, the MU standards, by updating the MU standards to provide a better balance between the compatible uses and design. And you can see the proposed language in attachment B of the staff report. The emphasis of the existing MU standards for the tertiary development zone relates more to compatible design than compatible land uses. One thing that a couple of the proposed standard changes that I wanted to mention, bring to your attention, I'll go over next. The first is this standard here that relates to vertical mixed-use structures. The current MU standards relate more to greenfield development, and they do not take into account existing development. Again, using 401 Elm Street as an example, that's a 2-story building that was built in 1872. It has contained non-residential land uses since its existence, and it became a mixed-use structure sometime in the 1920s. However, under the MU standards as written, in the fact that it would be designated a tertiary development zone, it would not be permitted to be developed with a mixed-use development. So staff recommends changing this standard to read that new construction of vertical mixed-use structures shall only be permitted in the primary and secondary development zone, and the development of existing multi-story buildings as vertical mixed-use structures is permitted in the tertiary development zone. Lastly, section 20-1108 J4I states that detached structures shall only be permitted in the tertiary development zone, and detached residential structures shall be required in tertiary development zones when surrounding existing structures are of the same form. Staff believes that the first sentence is still applicable, but that the second sentence should be deleted. Instead, the land use tables of Article 4 and the density and dimension standards of Article 6 provide a mechanism to determine compatible development within the tertiary development zone. So staff recommends that the Planning Commission forward the proposed amendment to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval.
Shall we discuss this, move on to item 1B after that?
Yeah, I think our plan was to do this and then do the next 2 items together, perhaps.
Okay. All right. Is the applicant here? Good evening.
Hello. It's nice to see you all again.
Hello.
I'm Margareta DeFries. I'm the owner of the building at 401 Elm. And I appreciate that you all are hearing this again so quickly after the last meeting. My rezoning request was definitely made more complicated by the various definitions of the primary, secondary, and tertiary development zones within mixed use. And that was only clarified a few days before the August agenda was published. There was no reference to these in the existing use table as far as I can tell. I didn't know about it before that. You are being asked to consider and hopefully will recommend this text amendment allowing these uses in the tertiary development zone. And I think that this will be a pretty fair application of zoning codes that will allow more flexibility for property owners, especially of existing structures, while also retaining the oversight of the planning and city commissions and reviewing the more impactful potential uses. I obviously have a vested interest in this passing, since my rezoning and special use permits that are items 1B and 1C both depend on this change. But I do think that this change benefits other applicants, city staff, and future planning and city commissions. Differentiating the primary and secondary from tertiary development zones more clearly in the use table with the new column will help an average person like me start a process like this with a more realistic expectation of what might be required. What I really appreciate though is that the planning staff also saw that this lack of a definition didn't make sense and were willing to think a little more creatively about how to solve my specific problem and this more general issue that they discovered. As hard as it was for me to be just excited about adding one more month to a set of processes that has essentially taken all of my spare time for the last 2 years since my dad died, I am all for any improvements that this can make to this process to get it simpler for people who come after me and for all of you.
Thank you. This is a public hearing item. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak on the text amendment portion of item 1? Our public hearings are designed to take input from neighbors and concerned parties in the general public. Our public hearings work this way. Members of the public are allotted 3 minutes to address the commission. If you're speaking for yourself only, if you're representing a neighborhood group or organization, you are allotted 5 minutes, and I'll try to watch the clock and give you a 30-second heads up.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name's Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement Association, and we would like to see this amendment moved forward and presented to the City Commission. We believe that this structure, this building will be a positive addition to North Lawrence. It's kind of been, you know, I've lived in North Lawrence all my life, and 1960 was the last year that it was a grocery store, Wiley's grocery store. And after that, it's been a little bit of everything. You know, residential, multiple residential. And so Margaretta has done a lot of work on this building and brought it back as a good building, and the residents, neighbors down there would like to see it be a productive building and mom and pop business. You know, it was kind of a woodworking shop in the back, and we'd like to see it continued that way, some type of mom art studio, woodworking shop, just a small low impact business with retail up front and residential upstairs. So we would encourage you to okay this text amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wish to comment on the text amendment? All right, seeing none, we'll give the applicant a chance to reply if she wants to. Normally, the applicant would have a chance to respond to the public comments made herein. Do you have anything to add, Margaret? Okay.
I have more to say later.
Okay, in that case, we will bring it back up here to the commission for discussion. Further questions?
Chairman, I have a question.
Commissioner Culver.
So what triggers a tertiary development zone is if it's adjacent to RS zoning, is that correct? Is that the single thing that triggers it from being primary or secondary?
Yes, otherwise, a development, when it comes in, designates the zone for the uses they're trying to get to.
Okay.
But if it's surrounded with the RS, it has to be tertiary. So
Okay.
for example, the HERE project has MU zoning,
Mm-hmm.
no tertiary because it's all RM zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Kelly.
So can you give us some examples of where we have tertiary MU zoning in this? I can't get our GIS map to work, and I'm not sure it would show us tertiary versus primary versus secondary.
We don't have any. We've got MU's a new district, about 2008, I think, roughly, after the 2006 code was adopted. It's been employed mostly along 14th Street in the Oria neighborhood. to help with some existing development at Bullwinkle site and along that 14th Street, sort of what historically had been commercial zoning there. And then the HERE development project employed MU really for the first time as a new development proposal. And I believe that's all we have. Oh, McLean's, I'm sorry, McLean's also had secondary zone established with it. And the district has gone through a few evolutions in the code as well. And so this is really the first time we've had the opportunity to apply the tertiary zone.
Commissioner Carpenter.
So the current, you have a tertiary zone, the only development permitted is basically single family, which is why we're not seeing any of these yet. So I appreciate the change in here, and I'm just looking at that staff has put into these recommended changes, a distinction between new developments in existing neighborhoods by, if I'm reading this right, if we have this in newer neighborhoods, you can build a multi-story building, but if it's in an existing neighborhood in a tertiary zone, you can't build a new multi-story building. You can only use an existing one to convert to these uses. Is that correct?
If I'm understanding, it may be opposite. So what we're saying is that if it's an existing, the code glitch now, in our opinion, is that you can't have vertical mixed use building in tertiary zone. The subject request sort of demonstrates to us that there may be times and circumstances where you have an existing building that's appropriate to be designated tertiary to keep the uses of a lower intensity, but that vertical mixing of the uses is appropriate. So we're trying to sort of relax the code a little bit to provide that opportunity. Whereas if you have a greenfield development where no existing buildings exist, we think that the difference in the zones should be more stark, and tertiary should be really tertiary, butt up against detached dwellings in a more stark fashion.
Okay. Well, I hope we pay attention to that distinction between looking at greenfield and existing neighborhoods as we look at the new comprehensive plan amendments, because there are some stark differences between how those areas develop. So I'm glad that's in here. All right. I had one question. What is a research center?
The research services.
Services, right.
Essentially, that's fully enclosed, kind of more or less an office, that there's some research components of that. So I think it's some lab space, some research and development type of uses, but essentially acts from a land use standpoint like an office use. What they're doing inside of that space is more research based, and there's no limitation necessarily on the number of employees or the size of it versus the limited production and manufacturing, which I think has language in it up to so many employees, so it's limited in scope.
Commissioner Lilly?
I also had a question about the use table, and it was on the industrial. The industrial limited was going to be permitted or special use, but the industrial technological was not, nor was it permitted in any of the other lower zoning categories. Is there any reason why that couldn't also be a use in mixed use tertiary?
I want to make sure we're looking at the same thing. So you're in the industrial category,
Right.
and it is which use again?
Manufacturing and production technological.
Okay. So Becky can speak to this as well. One of the things that we looked at was when we review the tertiary uses was whether or not it was allowed in MU primary or secondary, and also sort of the uses in their scope and what they do. And this one wasn't originally in the MU district. I think that weighed in our decision. It doesn't have a limited component to it for the tertiary zone, like the limited manufacturing and production does. And so it's not that it couldn't be compatible as a special use permit, but that it's not allowed at all in the primary and secondary, I think, weighed in the decision. So if you think it's compatible in tertiary, then it would also stand to reason that it would be compatible in the primary and secondary zones, either as a permitted outright use or as a special use permit itself. I think when we originally built the MU district, we steered a little bit away from some of the industrial uses. As uses were added to the code, like the makerspace, they were brought in, and some of them were put into the MU district. Originally, there was very few. Really, it was only the limited manufacturing and production that was allowed in the primary and secondary zones of MU.
I'm just thinking like a tech company, that kind of thing, I don't know if that would fall under, if I'm thinking of it in quite the right way.
Yeah, and I'd have to look up the definition of that specifically. Do you have it? Production, processing, assembly, or packaging of products that rely upon research and technological innovation, research instruments, electronic products, surgical and medical instruments, does not include uses that require federal air quality discharge permits. So it's a manufacturing component, so with that, sometimes you get the more intense truck traffic and delivery services and those sorts of things, whereas the reason we have built in a limited one is because it's a smaller scale production company.
Thank you.
Question, where did tertiaries, I mean, it just strikes me as interesting that we're creating this whole column for tertiary zoning and we have none of it. It seems like we're doing, I'm just trying to get my head around about why we have this column at all. I guess that's I mean, I can see that there may be different zones and intensities of mixed use, but maybe we just don't want mixed use in a residential neighborhood. And I know that the case that comes up, but I want us to think a little bit about mixed use in a residential neighborhood. This was an existing use that's been in place for a long time. I don't want to create zoning and a whole new column for a property. That's where I'm coming from. So can you give just a little background on where tertiary comes from?
I think when we were reviewing the code, the distinctions made between primary, secondary, and tertiary are built in, not in the table, but in the MU district narrative. So because we hadn't had a request for tertiary zoning or a need to require it, we hadn't put it to the test, if you would. So after initiation, we went into the code and we said, well, there are a lot of distinctions to it, and they're pretty rigid distinctions. If we're going to propose relaxing those distinctions or altering them, then it makes sense, because there were a few different ways we looked at building the code. One was to keep it all in one column and then use our use standards to make the distinctions. It got a little too complex for that, where we thought, well, a new column would just show us pretty clearly for us in the development community what's allowed in primary and secondary, what's allowed in tertiary. Those are the starkest distinctions between the zones, and that's how we arrived at a new column for it. Instead of hunting for standards and the distinctions in the code, in the narrative of the code, which becomes a little bit complicated, we thought the easiest way to do it and reflect it was in a new column. I think to answer your question about should mixed use be in a neighborhood, I would point to our comprehensive plan update procedure, where we are identifying a desire to have more activated neighborhoods with with more mixing of uses, with more commercial retail convenient to the neighborhood. And I think that this does lend itself to moving toward those policies. I might just add, I do think that it is addressing sort of a need in existing areas because, except for the HERE project, we've only used it in areas and on properties that are mixed use themselves for, prior to the 2006 code that needed a tool, a zoning tool, to help them redevelopment or change use. That's why we get it at the bookstore. That's how we get it in some of the smaller lots in the Oriad neighborhood. That's how we're getting it here. So while we built it, as Becky said, with Greenfield in mind, an unintended result was that existing developments are finding a lot more use for it than Greenfield development so far.
Commissioner Willie.
I would echo that some. I think it's new to us, and we're kind of stretching into that and what that might mean for how we develop neighborhoods. But it also kind of harkens back to how our historic neighborhoods worked, and maybe gives them some validation for how that was occupied in the first place. So it's new, and yet it's kind of historical also. So I do hope that if we adopt this and have more applications for tertiary use, that we'll kind of see our neighborhoods function maybe a little bit more comprehensively after that. So it doesn't bother me that this may be the first time to use it.
I would add that it generally provides a pathway to doing that while still providing control over individual applications.
I'm just trying to find the connection between primary, which is high pedestrian, which seems like downtown to me, right? Moderate pedestrian, which seems like some of these like when I think of so one that I would think of here would be a corner store. We don't really have corner stores here in Kansas, but on the East Coast, they're pretty common. It's a neighborhood store. This would be that vertical mixed use. There might be a home above and down below. But do we consider that tertiary or secondary? I'm trying to find which category it goes into, and are we pushing too hard to get that mixed use into neighborhoods that are clearly residential neighborhoods? And I know we don't have any, but the idea is that we could in this, then that may come. I just want to make sure we think through a text amendment, because that's a big change. That's a big change. So I just want to make sure we think through.
And to that point, it requires rezoning to
Right.
MU with mostly, most instances, a special use permit, so the community will get a lot of participation in those instances.
And there's a lot of things that have to happen here. First, we have to actually rezone something other than 401 Elm, right? Because we have nothing. Then it may work for something that is a greenfield development, and then they have to go through the special use permit. So we may have made the bar so high that this will never exist, but at least we have the option that it may some point exist.
I'm not sure I understand your bar so high comment.
Well, I think, so first we have to actually zone it. We'd have to change the zoning of a neighborhood, right? Because we have, Scott said, we have no tertiary mixed use anywhere, right? It doesn't exist. There's no, so if we're going to do it on an existing property, we have to change the zoning first. So there's one pass at the Planning Commission and the City Commission or County Commission. City just, right? Yeah, just city. And then the next pass would be if it's a special use permit, and most of the intensive uses on here are special use permits. Does that give us enough, that's where I say the bar
Oh, I see.
becomes so high that you
So you're saying
gotta jump through 27
the height of
hoops.
the bar gives you comfort?
Well, I don't know
In-
that
in
it gives
sum-
me comfort, I'm
in
just,
summary.
it would be interesting to see if we use it before I die, how about that?
But, and Commissioner, it would be really the only tool to get at a certain outcome in some instances, short of going to a commercial district or
Mhm.
something. So in some ways, it's just expanding the options that a neighborhood or developer or owner could, have at their disposal to come ask the question to the planning commission and city commission about, is it compatible and is it appropriate?
I mean, essentially, to trigger this, what we're looking at is somebody's gonna wanna rezone an individual property in a residential neighborhood from residential to mixed use, and then pick something out of column C and see if they can put it in by right or need a special use permit. So I think some of the devil's in the details of just what's on this list and what do you want in a residential neighborhood, like in the middle of a block. Or, somebody's gonna come in and say, we want, MU for my 2-story residence so I can have an apartment upstairs and whatever downstairs. I
And
mean,
a
that's
limited manufacturing plant.
limited manufacturing
downstairs.
plant in the middle of a block. I think that's where you're
That's where I'm
going
getting
with
at,
this.
yeah.
And that's why I was curious, and what I brought up at the mid-month meeting is how is this going to tie into the proposed comprehensive plan, which is pushing the concept of mixed use in residential neighborhoods as part of neighborhood planning? Because I think, the older neighborhoods that don't have any of this, but there are some properties that might want to take advantage of changing to do something like this, what the impact will be there as opposed to some of the newer. We're not going to see this happen in most neighborhoods. I think it's mostly the older ones with some larger structures that would push this through. But, if you're out in a neighborhood that everybody's on a large lot and with drive into your garage at night and you don't really have sidewalks, you're not going to see this pop up. This is mostly the older neighborhoods that are going to see somebody want to make use of this. So I've been struggling thinking through this because I like the idea and I see pitfalls in it also.
Isn't the main point to have an option for everybody to be able to consider every request individually though? Just curious.
Thank you. I would note that the limited manufacturing and production is already permitted out by right in MU.
Yeah, but so that would be, it would come before the planning commission to recommend or deny a rezoning. So, but if you have this in our code that you can do these things in tertiary multi-use zoning, you're one step down the way to say, look, you allow this in the code, so you should permit me to rezone my individual property on a street of nothing but residential houses.
And I think that's where the special use permit comes in, that complements this change, especially as it abuts to RS zoning, is that it does have a formal process to look at the rezoning first, and then a special use permit for a lot of these uses to where it really needs to be compatible if it's gonna fit within a neighborhood that's primarily, single residence.
And I certainly take comfort in special use permits because it does have yet another bar to climb through. But to the person who commented there, I don't want to be the bane of future planning commissions when their agendas are 3 days long doing special use permit after special use permit. For those who haven't been here for special use permits, they are challenging for us. They have a lot of stuff that we have to consider, and it's what I think are the most murky. Anytime we do conditional zoning, I think we're in the murkiest waters that we can be in. So I don't want to set us up, and I don't think we are here, but I don't want to set us up where we're approving every single use that's happening in the city. We're far from that, but just thinking through all these things.
That brings me back to research service, because it just pops up out of nowhere. You know, it's not permitted in other residential districts that staff reviewed for this. Suddenly it's in multi-use districts and permitted in primary and secondary, and a special use permit in tertiary. So I'm wondering permitting by right is something that doesn't even come to us if the zoning is approved. So I think we have to take care on those if they're already on, in the code for the residential areas, permitted by right. It doesn't cause me as much concern, but the one that pops up for the first time as a bright red P does cause me some concern.
Scott, can you perhaps shed a little light on how the research service was deemed to be suitable for that?
I think it was, again, with the SUP as the mechanism to determine compatibility in any specific context, the land use impacts of that use, we think, can be compatible in the right situation. But that's just a proposal. If you feel otherwise, you could strike that from the text amendment and not have it as a special use permit, or even permit it in the primary and secondary. It, at least in our opinion, makes sense in primary and secondary because those are the higher intensity uses. Those are not necessarily adjacent to detached dwelling uses, that sort of thing. So. I think the commissioners that have been through this a bit with us know that when this code was developed in 2006, we've literally done, hundreds of text amendments. Sometimes it takes a specific project to get us looking very narrowly into each use and how they relate to each other and how they're compatible. You could look at our land use table probably and scratch your head at a few relationship issues there. So this has given us the ability and opportunity to go in and have those harder analysis to the uses.
Commissioner Willie?
I'm in favor of expanding mixed use in general. And I think that sometimes we have to put it out there and test the waters, and we may come back and say we missed the mark. But I do like to be responsive to, it starts as an individual project, but we are tasked with looking at the whole area, the whole city, and how we zone it. But this, to me, it's fairly new, but I'd like to see us adopt this, try it out, try it on for size. It may not be exactly right, but I think that it will give us some options for some creative moves that come in the city. So I will be in favor of it so far.
Have we ever pulled back on a text amendment once it's been approved? Do you have to initiate a new text amendment to
We do.
rescind it?
We've done some text amendments that piggyback on top of each other with parking in the ORIAD with congregate living, for example.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable supporting it. Just want us to think about what we're supporting and go through the process of what this means away from 401 Elm. And yes, we do have to have those things which test it. I think we've built in enough safety here that we can test it at a very low level without it I don't think we're gonna have 27 applications for rezoning MU tertiary tomorrow, you know, if we pass this, but just, I think text amendments carry a lot of weight because it gives guidance to the development community, it gives guidance to citizens on how they can use the property and how property can be used around them. So I just think we consider this with a lot of weight.
Well, I certainly appreciate Commissioner Kelly's caution. I did meet with the applicant before our previous meeting and explained to her that the city and the comprehensive plan are generally favorable about mixed use and its continued development, but that this site and this project was not what the Planning Commission would solely consider, and that our charge is to consider the farther reaching ramifications of something, especially as Commissioner Kelly's pointed out, as important as a text amendment. And so whatever our feelings about a particular project, we have larger and larger future plans to consider. And so I thank Commissioner Kelly for continuing his vigilance in that regard, and Commissioner Carpenter as well. I will support this text amendment, and I think it's a good balance of progress and protection and control, protection of the neighborhood and control by this commission, I think provides a good balance, so I'll support it. Commissioner Willie,
I would make a motion if we're
please
ready.
do.
I would make a motion that we forward the proposed text amendment 17-00495 to the City Commission with recommendation for approval.
Thank you. We have a motion from Commissioner Willie. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Commissioner Carpenter seconds. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor raise your hand. Opposed? None. Motion carries unanimously. On to item B, the rezoning.
And I think our plan here is to give you the presentation on zoning and special use permit, and then separate discussion and motions afterward.
All right, so next we have a rezoning and a special use permit request for the property at 401 Elm. This property is located in North Lawrence. It is currently zoned RS5. It is surrounded to the east, south, and west by RS5 zoning, and there is IG zoning to the north. The surrounding land uses are shown here in this color-coded map. The yellow indicates single-family residential. The brown color is multi-family residential. The red represents commercial. This represents the neighborhood church. This aerial here provides you a glimpse of the character of the neighborhood. Aside from the residential component of the neighborhood, there are commercial uses to the northeast at the corner of 3rd and Locust. There's an active rail line and silos like north of Locust Street. As I mentioned, there is a church southwest of the property. Not quite shown in the picture here, this is Woodlawn Elementary School. There is also a restaurant and a bicycle shop located further to the west, and then we have the levee trail located south of the property. The rezoning request does comply with the comprehensive plan. Policy 3.6 in Chapter 5, the residential land use chapter, indicates that neighborhoods, the preservation enhancement of the visual character of the neighborhood. The subject property, the structure on the subject property was built in 1872. I'm going to mention this a lot, but it's been in existence since that time as a non-residential use, and then as a mixed-use land uses starting in 1920. It's been a component of the neighborhood really grew around that existing structure. Also, policy 3.5 of the comprehensive plan says that we should minimize the encroachment of non-residential uses by evaluating the different land uses and ensuring compatibility. As part of the application, there's a special use permit that's been submitted, and there are some conditions that have been applied to that special use permit to help minimize the negative, potential negative aspects. And then last, in Chapter 6, the commercial land use, that policy states that areas that contain mixed use should be preserved. And this, as I mentioned, this is an area, this particular subject property has contained mixed use since 1920. Another factor to consider is the suitability of the uses for which it's been restricted. As I mentioned, the property is currently zoned RS5. It contains a woodworking shop in the back section of the structure. There is a non-ground floor residential component on the second floor. This section of the building is currently vacant. It has contained residential uses and non-residential uses in its history. So the purpose, the intent of the rezoning application is to bring these non-conforming land uses, the woodworking shop, which is the production and manufacturing limited use, and then the non-ground floor dwelling, into compliance. They're not permitted under the RS5 zoning, but would be permitted with approval of special use permit in the tertiary zone of the MU zoning district. Just to give you an idea of the existing woodworking shop, here's some pictures from inside that. Moving on to the item 1C, the special use permit. This is a special use permit to permit the manufacturing and production limited use and a retail general use. This table here shows the density and dimensional standards that are applicable to a tertiary development zone in the MU zoning district, as well as the density and dimensional standards that exist on the subject property. The subject property is fairly close to being compliant with those standards. The highlighted yellow, however, are standards that are not, there is not compliance. However, section 20-1108D of the MU standards indicates that structures that existed prior to being rezoned are considered non-conforming with regard to the development standards. And Article 6 is referenced in those MU standards, and so staff has made an interpretation of the code that the structure is a non-conforming in that regard, and that these density and dimensional standards are not applicable to this property. I also wanted to mention parking. The three uses would require 7 parking spaces. The manufacturing and production limited under the parking standards would require 2 parking spaces. The retail component would require 3 spaces, and then the residential component would require 2 spaces, so that's a total of 7 spaces. The application that was submitted for the special use permit showed 5 parking spaces along Elm Street, and MU zoning does permit on-street parking to be counted towards meeting the parking requirement. The parking needs to be adjacent to the subject property. So there is a parking opportunity along 4th Street. There is not, however, along Elm Street. That street, there is no parking permitted on the north side of Elm. So there is parking that is permitted on the south side, but because that's not immediately adjacent to the subject property, it can't be counted towards the meeting the parking requirements. So the site plan showed 5 parking spaces, and they were dimensioned, the typical dimension of 18 feet in length. However, this is an incorrect dimension for parallel parking, code dictates that parallel parking spaces be 24 feet in length. So we don't have an updated site plan to show those dimensions and the changes in parking that would entail, but doing a rough measurement of the property line, excluding this existing drive that goes into the woodworking shop, it would appear that there is a potential for a total of 3 parking spaces along here. Staff is still recommending approval, staff is still recommending that the parking standards be waived. This is given that the retail component, the proposed retail component would serve the surrounding community, and it would be more non-motorized transportation. And the applicant has shown adding 4 bicycle parking spaces the front of the property. And this, as I mentioned, the retail component would require 3 parking spaces, and given the non-motorized transportation of that potential of that retail store, that bicycle parking could be adequate. But I should also mention that we did not receive a lot of communication on this property. Mostly we received supportive communication, but we did hear from one item of concern that we did hear was in regard to parking and the availability of parking. Another factor to consider is compatibility of use with the surrounding land uses. And the special use permit does contain the following conditions to help mitigate impacts with the surrounding community. I'm going to note that these conditions were taken from our home occupation type B standards, so they do align with those. So they would restrict exterior storage of materials and the fabrication of product outside. There is also a condition on the level of noise that can be emitted, and that it would have to align with the city's noise ordinance. And then there is a condition regarding when truck deliveries and pickups would be permitted. And again, these align with our home occupation type B standards, which permit those from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. The revised site plan that was submitted did not contain this condition, and staff recommends that this condition be added to that site plan as a condition of approval. And this one is regards to hours of operation for the manufacturing and production limited, and it would have those hours of operation be between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Again, this is a condition that aligns with the home occupation type B standards. The staff recommends forwarding the rezoning application to the City Commission with a recommendation for approval based on the findings of fact listed in the staff report. The staff also recommends approval of the special use permit for the production and manufacturing and production limited and the retail general uses, and forwarding the request to the City Commission with recommendation for approval subject to the following conditions. The provision of a site plan performance agreement, that the parking be updated with the correct parking dimensions and number, and that the following condition be added to the site plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. The applicant care to speak on the item more?
Hello. I am not going to repeat my entire presentation from last month's meeting. I think you were all here to see it, but I just want to quickly reiterate the main points. I'm trying to bring the building into compliance for the existing and historical uses. It was built as an industrial space in 1872 and predates all the residential surrounding it. And it's not a residential building, so it's hard to make it a residential building. primary uses over the past 150 years have been commercial and industrial, especially downstairs. The woodworking shop fills the rear portion of the building, but is laid out and best suited for only 1 or 2 people, which is why I was requesting only the limited manufacturing and production. Historic preservation is important to me with this building, even though it's not eligible for any designation at this time because of the age of the stucco on the outside. I believe that rezoning the building also benefits the neighborhood, allowing me to provide 2 new spaces for unique North Lawrence businesses. And if it's not rezoned, it impacts not just me, but my brother Nico, preventing either of us from being able to use the building or equipment in ways that benefit ourselves, but also our neighbors and the neighborhood. As far as the special use permit, nothing says adventure quite like preparing a special use permit in 2 weeks. But I had a lot of help, and I also want to recognize that the planning staff also turned their part of this process around in only 2 weeks, so that it was ready for tonight's meeting. I'm really excited about the fact that the bicycle parking can be part of the accommodation to fulfill the parking requirements for the retail space. It was already on my wish list to add some bicycle parking, and so this is definitely an added incentive for me to add bike racks sooner instead of later. Regarding the car parking spaces, while I understand that the dimensions of parking spaces in the code are 24 feet long, from a practical standpoint of personal use, 5 cars fit along that curb pretty easily, especially if people don't leave a half a car space in between every car. We regularly park 5 cars along there. I'm not 100% thrilled with this suggestion that we limit the hours of operation to the workshop to 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Most of the people who might use the woodworking shop don't necessarily limit their hours of use to those hours. And also the lack of climate control in the workshop means that the ideal work hours in summer months in Kansas are mornings and late evenings. A mandatory 7 p.m. stopping time could cut the workshop's available time in half in the months with the most daylight hours. I did speak to my neighbors to find out what their actual concerns about noise were from last month's meeting, because I was a little bit curious about that. They're specifically concerned about the potential for noises louder than or other than the woodworking shop if it changed uses in the future. And I think that that is addressed in the fact that any other use in the future would also require a special use permit application process, in which case myself or the other whoever was doing it would have to come before you and justify it again before they could change the use of the shop. I also would like to say that I think that having another public hearing and commission process just to extend the allowable hours of operation by only 3 hours per day is a waste of your time and mine. Simply requiring that they be in compliance with the city noise ordinances and trusting the effective enforcement of city noise ordinances should be sufficient. I do propose that I will put a good neighbor clause in any future lease for the downstairs spaces, requiring that everyone comply with noise ordinances, and that work done outside of those hours in the woodworking shop might be completed with the garage door closed if possible. I do have a short audio clip from my brother. I don't know if now is a good time to play it or when for the public hearing part. Do you have a preference?
How long is it?
Less than 3 minutes. I think he timed it. I didn't time it, but I listened to it. It was pretty short.
Let's have it.
And I have no idea how to change the audio level on this. If it's too loud, I apologize.
My name is Nikon DeVries. I would like to thank the planning staff, commissioners, and other city staff that have helped us get this process so close to complete so fast. My sister Margreta has been doing so much work on this that I would like to thank her publicly as well. In 1979, when I was born, my parents already owned the building at 401 Elm Street, giving me literally a lifetime of experience there. Today I would like to address the restrictions on shop operation hours proposed for the special use permit due to noise concerns. I do not believe there should be any extra restrictions at all. In my opinion, the standard city noise ordinance should be completely adequate. I am a person who has worked in that shop for uncountable hours all around the clock. I can attest that in my personal experience, there has never been even one instance of any neighbor coming by the shop to say something about the noise bothering them. This time restriction would be a major obstacle in our ability to rent the shop. For example, one artist has told us that he is interested, but he has a family and a job. His responsibilities to those priorities take up pretty much every hour that it would be legal to operate under the proposed rules. There are parts of artistic woodworking processes involving glue and finish work that need to have average ambient air temperatures. During summer months, it's best to do these things at night. While the likelihood that these activities would make any noise is practically zero, it would be technically illegal for these things to be happening at night. In the past, when we have needed to use basic machinery at odd hours, we have had no issues containing sound. If a person lives within earshot of 401 Elm, then they might straighten every picture in the house every day due to the freight trains that rumble through, blasting their horns for the 3rd Street crossing several times per hour. Those horns are 150 decibels. The shop is less than 100 yards from the tracks. At that distance, the loudest machines being run inside the walls of the shop could easily be completely drowned out by every single train that passes. Needless to say, anyone who decides to live in or moves to this part of town is pretty okay with some background noise. This is a situation where concern for the neighbors is getting complicated when it's really quite simple, in my opinion. We will continue to have a standard of respect for established citywide noise ordinances, and the shop will continue to be a good neighbor as it has for the last 40 years with an open door policy, but not when the door should be closed. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak on the rezoning or special use permit? Please sign in, state your name.
So my name is Priscilla Howe, and I live at 415 Elm. I used to live at 347 Elm, which is across the street. And I know I said this at the last meeting, but I'm going to say it again. That I lived there when Gunter was there, and I never was bothered by the sound. I also want to say that, the sound of the trains is much louder. I'd like to say that Natalia had to leave, but she wanted someone to reiterate what Nico just said, that there are a lot of aspects of woodworking that happen that are very quiet. And if it is the case that the business can't be operated after 7 p.m., then that limits, that means there are hours when they could be doing that work, the quiet work. Anyway, that building has, Gunter was always a good neighbor in terms of sound, in terms of noise, and I expect that it would be the same. It will continue in that same way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ted Boyle, North Lawrence Improvement. I'd like to say there's a couple of times that there was parking problems when there was more residential in the building. There used to be at least 3 apartments in there, and I think the owner lived in the basement for a period of time or had a camper out back, and we got that taken care of. But the parking problems was the residential part. And so with the one apartment upstairs, hopefully that would be resolved. Noise is always compared in North Lawrence to the train. You know, the trains, we're working on a quiet zone. So those trains from about 10 o'clock in the evening till 6 o'clock in the morning, hopefully we're gonna get those silenced. But comparing them, your noise to a train noise and or future businesses that might go in there that are not a carpenter shop could be a lot more noisier. So, you know, and the special use permit, doesn't that allow for, you can put a review every year, every 5 years or something like that? Well, you know, North Lawrence Improvement, we advocate for getting this building in the mainstream, have it a contributing structure to North Lawrence. And there are a lot more businesses that are in residential blocks in North Lawrence that y'all probably don't know about. I know 3 that are about 3 blocks from there, and been there for 10 years or better, and surrounded by homes. Now, you know, what it takes is a complaint from a neighbor. A happy neighbor is like a happy wife. Everybody's happy, you know what I mean? So you keep your neighbors happy, that's the way to do it. But I think that on the special use permit, I think that we ought to talk about some type of review just to see how this is working out, since we've changed the zoning on this. See how it's going to work out in other neighborhoods maybe, you know. But I think whether, I don't know, maybe every 5 years or something, or every 2 years, to have a review and check it out and make sure all the neighbors are happy. And you know me, if there's a problem, I'm going to be at the city commission or at the city manager's office. So I think with some type of review on the special use permit, I think the rest of it would be all right. So, but we need to check it out. And what sets the precedence on how often we would review it? I mean, do you guys do that every 2 years, every 5 years, or something like that? So
That's something that would be specified in the conditions.
yeah, well, I think that ought to be specified. We have talked over that in the NLIA, and you know, they support what Margaretta's doing, but let's make sure it stays to the plan, you know, and let's have a review. Whatever you said will be fine for us longer, as long as it's not no more than 5 years, you know. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Further public comment? Seeing none, Margaret, is anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you've heard enough from me
Okay.
today.
Then we'll bring it back up here to the commission for more discussion and questions. Commissioner Sinclair.
I hope to, I'm going to ask a question that's going to betray my ignorance and inexperience, but if we were to approve, or if it goes through the process and both the rezoning and the special use permit are approved, is there anything to, I guess, is the owner required to operate the property within the restrictions of the special use permit, or could they change of their own volition to do any of the permitted uses in a mixed-use tertiary development zone?
So the special use permit is for those uses, the manufacturing and production limited and the retail general. If they wanted to develop the property with another use that's permitted in the tertiary with a special use permit, it would come back through the planning commission and the city commission for approval of that.
If it's a special use, if it's a permitted use, then they would need at least site plan approval, administrative approval, which would typically get notice to the neighborhood.
Okay, and so that was my question, because I was looking at some of the permitted uses, and I mean, one of them is, you know, like a payday car title loan business, which I don't know if, and I know that,
Not gonna happen.
right, and
But
I
maybe an office would be a better example. So I think an office is a permitted use, and my understanding is that I could let it be an office without more than administrative approval of the site plan change.
With site plan approval.
okay, and that was my question, just because I know, having been through some of these on the other side of this desk, one of the questions I always have had is what could be. You know, I know what the owner is saying, what the goal is, but you know, I think about that. So that was what I was hoping to hear.
Commissioner Kelly.
So, looking at Google Maps, there seems to be a trailer on the, is it the north?
Pictures from 2011,
Okay.
and the trailer was removed about a week after my dad died. So
Okay.
it's been gone for 2 years.
What's the distance from the end of the building to that alley?
I think it's about 8 feet.
About 8 feet.
The trailer was very narrow.
Okay.
And my dad was using it as a summer living room, but it was in bad shape. when we
So
got rid of
not
it.
long enough for park. I was looking at El Matador, which is, a similar, it's another use that doesn't have, the parking concerns me.
Yes.
And not for what your intention is,
I understand.
but for what the future may hold. And that,
So, just so that you know, my real job is in parking at KU. So parking is actually one of the fundamental things that I think about when I look at that and
Mhm.
uses. And part of why I was excited that some bicycle parking could help mitigate that. I have some thoughts about other ways that parking that's not directly adjacent might be used, but for this particular purpose, since I'm not anywhere near having anything ready for the front, it didn't seem as applicable to discuss tonight. But definitely parking is high on my list of considerations as I think about what to do with it.
yeah, for our discussion, I don't want to set the precedent of just waiving parking requirements, especially in a mixed-use setting. And I was just looking at that spot where that trailer was, if that was possible to create some additional parking there.
A car fits there. There's currently a pickup truck belonging to one of my tenants sitting there while he waits to tag it, so it's off the street. That's also where the trash bins and recycling bins sit, so you have to have a way to pull off of there without upsetting the trash and recycling bins. But it is possible to pull onto it from the alley. You can't actually pull onto it from the street.
Okay.
And theoretically, sorry, it just popped into my head, theoretically, 3 of the parking spaces apply only to the front retail space. And as long as that's not developed, the parking is in compliance with what would actually be in use until I get that fixed or get that development going.
Commissioners, I'd like to address the parking issue if we could. There's 2 ways that parking supply versus demand can be waived or varied. One is through the variance procedure to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and one is the code gives staff some authority to waive any zoning standard, really, when we deem it to be reasonable. And that's usually through a site plan process where people get the notice, and so it's all a very transparent process. We've built a history over the years to use our judgment on when all things considered, meaning what's the existing circumstances, what are the proposed circumstances, what are the use and intensity of what's proposed, to determine whether or not we can support a waiver of, usually it's 1 to 3 spaces or somewhere in there. These are pretty low intensity uses proposed from a parking perspective. If this were a bar, a restaurant, kind of a high serving restaurant, that parking standard would shoot up, and I would not feel comfortable in recommending a waiver. What we usually do there is steer them to the Board of Zoning Appeals. In this particular situation, because the site plan, which would normally be administrative, is going with a special use permit, what our practice is, and that is that staff is making a recommendation on what our determination would be if it were a site plan, administrative site plan, and giving that authority in the code to ultimately the city commission to make the final decision. So I just wanted to explain a little procedurally what's going on with that parking issue, because you don't have authority to grant variances to parking except for the code section that gives it to staff to then move up the line in the special use permit scenario.
Further discussion?
Question, the hours of operation, where did those hours come from?
Those are taken from the standards from the home occupation type B.
Is that what my dad had was home occupation type B?
Right, sorry, I should clarify that, yes. And so the woodworking shop existed prior as a home occupation type B use, and so that's why we drew that comparison.
My dad worked all hours, though. I would like to say that he probably never paid any attention to those hours of operation.
I think we were basing it too in the concept that the tertiary zone should be compatible with residential uses, and that was one way to get at it. And so again, it's our proposal to you to get the discussion going and hear from the neighborhood about the impacts.
Well, having most of those tools in my basement, I can say I use them all different times. You know, it just depends, just like what was said, different parts happen at different times, and I certainly don't run the big saws when somebody's trying to sleep in the house, but, you know, I would hope most woodworkers would keep that kind of thing in mind, because that's when you're gonna get neighbors yelling when the table saw goes off or the planer's being used at 2 in the
In
morning.
fact, the table saw is the only machine that you can hear outside of the building regularly.
Yeah.
All of the rest of them don't get loud enough to sound like much more than a lawnmower.
Just a comment, I've been to Frank's North Star after 7 PM, and there's a few bands that are a little louder than,
But
A
they have
planer.
commercial zoning.
but it's in that neighborhood, I mean, it's in that same neighborhood.
Yeah.
Commissioner Coleman.
Yeah, in regards to hours of operation, I think if we did deviate from what is proposed, I would support Mr. Boyle's recommendation that we do put a review mechanism in there. And I think 5 years would be a little too long in this case, but maybe a 2-year period to revisit it if we go away from the proposed hours of operation. And I also think that could give us some indication on the parking. That would appease me.
I would agree with that shorter term, because this is the first one we're
Correct.
doing. Also, it would give us some, well, most of us are still here and are passing this, that we'd be able to evaluate how this is actually working if we have a review of this one.
Commissioner Payton.
What is involved in that review process?
So I'll speak to that. We rarely set time limits on special use permits in the city. One of the reasons is without conditions to review against, what are we really reviewing? If we get, we could track whether or not there have been noise complaints or property maintenance complaints or complaints of any nature, I suppose, over time, and bring that back. But if we're waiting 5 years to drum up enough complaints to analyze, it's an awkward process. I think we support, looking at the impacts of a use or potential impacts and setting conditions to them to help mitigate that, and then it's at least something for us to use to monitor the site. Any special use permit, you're taking a bit of a risk by approving. The other side of the setting time limits, not necessarily on this one because it's an established use, an established business, but a lot of times if we put time limits on new development, it's hard to finance that because they just don't know. It's at risk with, I think, Brian, we've been part of those discussions about, well, from a banking perspective, how can you go to the bank with that, with a 5-year or 2-year kind of special use permit, especially if you're investing more significantly than what's investing here. So that's our perspective. We could do it, but we would be a little bit challenged to know what to do at the end of 2 or 5 years, except to make everyone go back through the process and bring it to light. There are probably some uses that could demand that. We have steered away from those in the past. What we do have, though, I think, which is a stronger thing that the code provides, is that if conditions are set and they're not being met, we have a revocation process that we can use, and we can bring that to the city commission And if conditions aren't being met, then we can hold hearings to put it on trial and see about revoking the special use permit. From our perspective, it may be a better method to establish a framework, make them prove that they can be good neighbors, and then they can come back through the process and loosen it up. That's a little more control on a use that may need some conditions than leaving it completely wide open and trying to put conditions on it after 2 or 5 years and learning what the issues are then. Does that make sense, that kind of reasoning?
Commissioner Wheeling?
So we've had a home shop at our house, so we have a little bit of insight into this. And as a former business owner, I would think that the idea of having a review time at 2 to 5 years would just put a whole amount of uncertainty into a business owner looking to invest in this property. So I would not be in favor of that for this condition. The hours of operation, though I know that there are some pretty great working hours between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. and we've used them well, I think that because this is a first project going into a neighborhood, for us looking at this mixed-use tertiary and how is that going to fit, I feel like we're going to need to have some known quantity of operating hours. I think a person coming in to rent this space, having that as a known issue, that may cramp them a little bit, but that it's not like having to go back and review it every 2 to 5 years. I think it will hamper the use of this building a little bit, but in terms of what we're tasked to speak to, not only the neighbors we've heard from that aren't worried about the noise, but also the neighbors that we haven't heard from, and just to imagine how this would interact in a residential neighborhood. I'm generally in favor of the hours, though I do understand the hardship of it.
And you may wish to extend them past what we're recommending if you are so moved.
See if there's any more discussion up here.
So we could extend those hours from 7 to 9?
Correct, because we make a recommendation to you, your recommendation goes to the city commission.
I'd like to hear from the applicant. Okay.
I would, Margareta. If I could just say first, I appreciate the suggestions of both the time limit on the SUP for that type of control and review, and being a woodworker myself, I appreciate the business needs of what is sometimes quiet operation. And I'm struggling with not the operation of table saws and power equipment, but the gluing up of wood in a quiet way in the space which is restricted. Technically, you wouldn't be in violation of the special use permit if you're out there applying glue or reading, making drawings or something like that. So I'm interested in finding a place where we can make both of those possible. The extension of hours would be one, I think. But is there some way we can discuss perhaps the use of power tools during the hours, and maybe, because there are, as one other speaker has said, there are quiet things that go on in a workshop that perhaps should not be restricted by time constraints. So I'd be interested in further discussion on that point. But go ahead, Margareta.
So there are 3 different sets of hours in my head that are at play here. Noise ordinance is 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., I think. If you make loud noise after 10 p.m., people will call and complain if they're bothered by it. I've done that before about neighbors screaming at each other. In fact, in North Lawrence, when I lived in the upstairs apartment, you could hear people 2 houses over yelling. But if we allow truck deliveries from 7 to 9, but only allow the shop to operate 7 to 7, then that's a little bit of a dichotomy. If truck deliveries are allowable until 9 p.m., then I think at least letting the shop operate until 9 would make more sense. But I think that having the noise ordinance govern what people are doing in there is enough. It's an already established ordinance that the city does enforce on complaint, that cops will show up if you're being too loud and people call to complain about it. as the owner of the building, I'm sure that I will hear from city staff if there are complaints to the city, and then we deal with it as they come up. And if I'm writing that into my lease as part of what I'm committing to say that you need to adhere to these noise issues, that should cover it and let people do the quiet work at whatever hours work for them, which is especially important in this space because of the fact that the building is not climate controlled in the workshop. It doesn't have any insulation, doesn't have any heating or air conditioning. It will take several years of people paying rent into the space before I even have a hope of adding any kind of climate control. They didn't have climate control when it was built, and so I feel like arbitrarily saying 7 to 7 just because that's what the home occupation allows is a little bit restrictive when there are these other ways that it can be restricted without having to add extra conditions. Makes sense?
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may speak to the way the noise complaints are handled at the city, it's a little bit of a dog chasing its tail. So we establish a use that has noise. The police department are called with complaints. They go out, they contact us. Is it an allowed use? Yes. Well, it's sort of inherent to the woodworking shop that noise is going to come out, and they're very challenged on what to do with a situation that has approvals by the city that creates noise, that then they get called out to stop the noise. So it's a little bit circular. It happens on such uses. So we do not rely on the city's noise ordinance to regulate land use. It's not a good practice, in my opinion. Noise ordinance is for nuisance noise, not a situation where we're controlling residential neighborhood issues with land use. So I did want to state that, because our basis really is on whether or not this is a compatible use with residential. And I would argue too that there's a difference between a homeowner who occasionally uses their power tools to do some chores around the house and a business that operates potentially 7 days a week. So we have a lot of experience with establishing uses that then end up being have some nuisance conditions, and we're just trying to cut those off because we don't want to create an issue that puts more demand on our already strained resources, namely the police department or code enforcement or those kinds of things. So if we want to think about creating some language that speaks to the use of machinery audible off the property and restricting those timelines and allowing some quieter uses in there, I think that's somewhere we could get, but please don't count on the city's noise regulations in dealing with our land use cases.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly.
So I want you to hearken back to an hour ago when I said that special use permits are some of the murkiest stuff that we do. And so here we're starting to do, well, is it 7 or is it 9 or is it the noise ordinance, or is it 2 or is it 3 or is it 5 years? I don't love these. I think these are, we start making recommendations with little to no evidence and no idea what's going on. I mean, I put a lot of trust in staff. They know the types of uses. This is an industrial use, limited it is, industrial it is, with some very nice people who are sharing with us. I'm fine with 7 p.m. If they know they're in violation if it's after 7 p.m. and they know how not to be in violation. So, I mean, I don't want us to sit here for 2 hours discussing whether 7, 7:30, 9, 3 different kinds of, is a hand drill, a power tool, is a table saw, that I'm just worried that this is why I don't love conditional zoning.
Yeah.
Commissioner Carpenter has brought me to the dark side.
Yeah.
So with that said, I'm going to make a motion. You guys can continue to talk about it if you want. Let me pull it up here. Where is it?
Before you do, may I make one suggestion?
Sure.
And that is I'm amenable to the 9 p.m. since the truck traffic is allowed. I understand that we are reflecting the home occupation standards in the 7 to 7. Something for you to consider in your motion.
My motion wasn't even going to be about the special use permit. I'll
Yeah,
let
of
somebody
course.
else do that. I'm going to move to recommend approval of the request to rezone approximately 2,500 square feet from RS5 to MU based on the findings presented in the staff report and forwarding it to the city commission with a recommendation for approval.
We have a motion from Commissioner Kelly to recommend approval. Is there a second?
I'll second the rezoning.
Pick whichever
Second by
one you
Commissioner
want.
Culver. Any further discussion on the rezoning? Seeing none, all those in favor of recommending approval, raise your hand. Motion carries unanimously. Would anyone care to make a motion on item 1C?
I see a struggle down there at the end, trying to put the words together.
Yeah, wow.
So I'm sitting here ruminating on the thought of whether or not it should be reviewed after a couple of years. Does the site plan performance agreement sort of have a mechanism for that if I at least say that I'm going to do it and then you have an option to say after 2 years you haven't done it and it's not doing it right, so we're gonna just take it back?
We've got the ability to take an SUP through the revocation process if there's evidence of not complying with the standards, with the conditions set. The site plan performance agreement is just a document that the applicant is saying that they will comply with the site plan that's been approved.
I'm not opposed to the idea of somebody saying in 2 years that they wanna at least look at it and make sure that it's operating the way that it should. I think that it makes extra work for everybody. If you think it's necessary though, I think that because we are changing the nature of how it operates from my dad being owner occupied to me running it as a separate entity from myself, that's a condition that I think is not completely unreasonable. But I care about the hours of operation more than that. Like, I think that the 9 PM or 10 PM allowable time for hours of operation matters more to me than perhaps having to come back and say, hey, yeah, the noise is working or it's not working. Here's all the complaints, here's the lack of complaints, and giving people an opportunity to weigh in again.
Thank you.
Ask a question.
Commissioner Culver.
Yeah, on the hours of operation, on the proposed recommendation, it says a change in hours of operation with this use would be subject to a new public hearing by the planning commission and city commission. Would that be applicant initiated at any time?
Can be.
With a fee, right?
Mhm.
Requires a whole new process.
Right. And hopefully after some time to determine if it's a problem or not.
Right. So there is an avenue for the applicant to initiate a change in those hours that we may set here today, but could be readdressed on their end at a later date.
Yeah, plus the opportunity to argue to the city commission to change them also. We're just gonna recommend to the
Mhm.
city commission what we think is best today. And then there's, they're gonna set the hours at this, when the city commission reviews this. My only concern is we've got two separate hours. I would rather have trucks at 7 PM or either both at 7 PM or both at 9 PM as opposed to two different hours, because loading and unloading trucks can be pretty noisy too, so. With that,
I would appreciate that consistency also.
All right, I'll make a motion. Chickens.
Commissioner Kelly.
I'm going to recommend approval of a special use permit to allow manufacturing and production limited and retail general uses located at 401 Elm Street and forwarding the request to the City Commission with the recommendation of approval, subject to the following conditions with an adjustment to be made on C3 from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. instead of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
Thank you, Commissioner Kelly. We have a motion to recommend approval. Do we have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Willie. Is there further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion with the adjustment as described by Commissioner Kelly, please raise your hand. All opposed? Carries unanimously. Thank you. Anybody require a brief break? Okay. You guys okay proceeding? Jim, you guys okay proceeding? We need a break. Okay. Then let's continue with item 2A, 3705 Clinton Parkway.
Hopefully you're not sick of me yet. Items 2A and 2B are for rezoning requests and a special use permit for the property at 3705 Clinton Parkway. The property is shown highlighted here. It is located on the south side of Clinton Parkway between Castle Drive and Crossgate Drive. The property is currently zoned RSO. It is, there is RM24 zoning to the east and west. There is PUD zoning to the north and RS7 zoning to the south. The land uses surrounding the property are multifamily to the northeast and west and single family to the south. The current land use of the property is a church. Previous land uses included an administrative office for the USD 479, and it was originally developed as a fraternal lodge. The previous zoning, at the time when the fraternal lodge was converted to the administrative office, the previous zoning was R02, which permitted that office use. It was then converted to the RSO zoning with the adoption of our current land development code. And in that land development code, there was a restriction to the amount of office that can be in a building under that RSO zoning. So under RSO zoning would permit 5,000 square feet of office use. This building is, I believe, 15,000 square feet, and there is a desire to redevelop it with office uses. So the RSO zoning inhibits the amount of space that could be developed with that office use, and so that's the request for the RMO zoning. This slide here shows the uses that are permitted under the RSO and under the RMO zoning districts, the uses that differ between the two. So a rezoning to the RMO zoning district would permit these 5 more intense uses. The purpose of both the RMO and RSO zoning districts is to accommodate low to medium intensity administrative and professional offices, and both are intended to be transition zones between higher intensity commercial areas and residential neighborhoods. The RSO district is best suited to be compatible with low and medium density residential neighborhoods, whereas the RMO is compatible with medium to high density. neighborhoods. And so given that there's the surrounding multifamily development to the northeast and west, the property is suited for the RMO zoning. As I said before, item 2B is for a special use permit for the active recreation use. So there's also a proposal to, aside from developing the existing structure with office uses, there's a proposal to build an additional building in the southeast portion of the property that would contain the active recreation use. The intent for this development is to relocate the existing team performance facility here. This is an indoor baseball and softball training facility. The site plan does show landscaping buffer yards along the west, east, and south property lines. Assuming that the RMO zoning district is approved, these buffer yards would not necessarily be required between the RM24 and the RM zoning district, but the applicant is still intending to add those buffer yards, as well as a 25-foot buffer yard between the south property line, to the south between the existing property and the single-family residential to the south, along with a 4-foot cedar fence located here. And the intent of this fence is to block the lights of cars as they come through here and potentially shine into the backyards of these houses. Staff recommends forwarding the rezoning application to the City Commission with a recommendation of approval based on the findings listed in the staff report. And staff also recommends approval of the special use permit for active recreation and forwarding the request to the City Commission with a recommendation of approval subject to the following conditions. Provision of a site plan performance agreement. The new building for the active recreation has not been designed yet, so that will be evaluated at with the building permit application. And then a drainage study and approval is still needed from the city stormwater engineer. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the applicant here tonight and care to speak on the issue?
I'm Alan Balott, and I'm here to represent the church and the contract purchaser. And I really can't add anything more to the staff report other than that this building was built in 1968. It was built in the county. And it has been there while all this development has taken place around it. And it all has seemed to work pretty well together, being a fraternal lodge with a swimming pool out in back, being the school district's administrative facilities, and then going to being a church. Converting the existing building back to offices, be similar use to the school district use. Remind you that there's a 3,000 square foot building on the rear of the property that we're removing. So the net increase is 6,000 square feet. And the two uses seem to work well together because the parking, the existing parking will more than meet the needs of both uses. But if there were any overflow, most of the active sports use will be in the evening and off hours when the offices won't be used. So we can use the parking lot and not have to increase the impervious surface to meet those needs. So otherwise, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
All right.
If you have any questions during your discussion, I'll be glad to pop up and answer those too. Thank you.
Thank you. We may have a couple. Is there any member of the public that wishes to speak on this item? No? If not, we'll bring it back up here for discussion and questions. Or motions.
Can I ask a question about noticing?
Sinclair, yeah.
We assume that the houses directly to the south of this property were all notified, or the owners, correct? Okay. Somewhat shocked that no one made any comments, but.
Well,
that's
it's not building multi-level apartment buildings right up the property, like that one right to the west.
Oh.
Right.
That
I'm
probably
familiar with that, right.
contributed to not having comments. I just have one question, that drive going down on the west side to the back, that the 4-foot fence is there for, is that actually a downhill back there? I mean, the only time I've ever been in that building was to register our kids in the school district, but.
Is that a notice of pop-up?
Yes, it is. But-
Yeah, the building, the existing building is 1 story from the street. You see 1 story,
Right.
but from the backside, it's 2 stories. So the proposed building, you would not see until you got down to the end of the drive with a circle driveway from the street.
I guess my only thing is that 4-foot fence gonna be enough to keep headlights out of people's back windows? Or is it now, because I assume it's been used now?
Well, that was an addition to the buffer yard landscaping that occurs out on the perimeter of the property. And there's quite a bit of landscaping, and there's coniferous landscaping in there. And actually, staff suggested putting some more plants in, and I thought, let's put a cedar fence in. It solves the problem, and it's permanent.
Okay.
So,
I guess nobody's complained about.
unless they
lights.
bring in semi-trucks to drop their kids off with the headlights being up high, I think that 4-foot fence will block the
Okay.
headlights.
Yeah, that was my only question about the whole thing, was just,
Well, I was glad I could
I'm-
answer
I'm-
that satisfactorily, right? Thank
you
you.
know,
Commissioner Sinclair, all of the homes immediately adjacent have rental licenses associated with them. It's our experience that that often doesn't bring out unless it's a severe impact to the hearing.
That makes sense.
Commissioner Colmer.
Yeah, I'd say with the buffers in place there that are existing, that are proposed, it makes it a smoother transition to the residential with this proposed office use. And so with that, I'd make a motion for approval of the request to rezone approximately 150,000 square feet from RSO, single dwelling residential office district, to RMO, multi-dwelling residential office district, based on the findings presented in the staff report, and forward it to the city commission with a recommendation for approval.
Thank you, Commissioner Culver, who moved to approve. Is there a second? Second from Commissioner Carpenter. Is there further discussion?
Just a comment.
Yes.
So I think this project's pretty exciting. It's infill development. That's what we want. And it's multi-use, which is also what we want as well. I'm really pleased that you're using it during the day and in the evening, and that it provides recreation for our kids who live in that area. I think that's really great. I also want to say I like the fence idea. Sometimes we put shrubs there, and sometimes they don't stay growing. They die. So just make sure it's tall enough to cover those headlights, because I think Jim's point is a good one. I want to make sure we don't shine that in that. So thank you for doing that. It's awesome. I'll vote for it.
All right. Motion is second. All those in favor of the motion as given by Commissioner Culver, please raise your hand. 6-0. Motion carries. On to the special use permit.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make a motion on
Thank
that. I'd make a motion for approval of the special use permit to allow the building addition for active recreation at 3705 Clinton Parkway, and forward it to the request to the city commission with a recommendation for approval, subject to the following conditions 1, 2, and 3.
Thank you. Moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Kelly. He's low. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion as read by Commissioner Culver, please raise your hand. Passes 6-0. Thank you all. And with that, do we have any further business?
Just to remind you, I don't think we're having an October mid-month meeting, so we don't have anything lined up. unless you have a topic of interest, but we're gearing up for our November orientation retreat, so
Okay.
happy Halloween.
Thank you. All right, with that, we are adjourned.
So,
Three taps.
federal money to approve